King Olumide had barely processed what had just happened when a firm knock came at the chamber doors. The palace protocols had arrived. The lead official, a tall, wiry man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, stepped forward and bowed slightly. His face, however, held no reverence, only urgency. "Your Majesty, the people of Abakar have gathered." The king tensed. The official glanced around cautiously before lowering his voice. "They are waiting to hear you speak, but," he hesitated, then swallowed. "Your Majesty, I must warn you, they are not in a good mood." The room, already heavy with tension, seemed to thicken. "They are angry," another protocol officer added. "Their faces are long with frustration. Their patience is at its limit. Whatever you say today, Your Majesty, it will either heal the kingdom, or break it beyond repair." The words settled like lead in the king's chest. For the first time, he felt the weight of what lay ahead. The people were at their breaking point. They had been patient for too long. And today, their king had to answer. King Olumide's gaze drifted downward to the file in his hand. The speech. The speech written by the 4 advisors. The very same advisors who had disappeared into the night and returned at dawn without a scratch. He had not even read it. He had no idea what words lay within its pages. A flare of anger surged inside him. How had he let himself be backed into this corner? He, the king of Abakar, was about to stand before his people and read a speech he had not even proofread? Unacceptable. His jaw tightened, and without a word, he turned on his heel and strode inside. He needed to prepare himself. Whatever was written in that speech, he would find out soon enough. The air was thick with tension. King Olumide stepped onto the raised platform, his robes fluttering slightly in the breeze. Before him stretched a sea of faces, angry, exhausted, and expectant. There were no cheers. No murmurs of respect. Just silence. The people of Abakar had come not to celebrate, but to demand answers. The king swallowed. He felt the weight of every hungry child, every weeping mother, every broken family in that crowd. He had ruled for years, but today, his throne felt more fragile than ever. There was no room for long formalities. No elaborate praises. The people wanted none of that. So, with a deep breath, he began. "My people, I stand before you today, not as a king who has come to speak above you, but as a father whose house is in crisis. A father who sees the pain in the eyes of his children. A father who knows that the cries of his people are no longer whispers behind palace walls, but thunderous echoes that shake the very foundation of this kingdom. I see you. I see the hunger that has crept into our homes like an uninvited guest. I see the markets, once overflowing with abundance, now lined with empty stalls. I see the laborious who work from dawn till dusk, only to return home with nothing but exhaustion. I hear the voices of our mothers, whose hands are now calloused from struggling to feed their young. I hear the frustration of our fathers, whose dignity is being tested every day. I hear the rage of our youths, who once dreamed of a future but now wake up to uncertainty. I do not stand here today to give excuses. I do not stand here to weave words that will make you forget your pain, nor to pour oil on troubled waters simply to keep my crown secure. Please subscribe. I stand here today because Abakar is at war. But our enemy is not a kingdom from across the seas. It is not an army with swords and shields. Our enemy is hunger. Our enemy is poverty. Our enemy is corruption. Our enemy is the decay of values that once made us great. And I will not stand idly by while these enemies destroy us from within. Some of you have whispered among yourselves, saying, "Where is our king? Why has he been silent? Does he not see what we are going through?" I have been silent, but not absent. While our people suffered, I was not locked away in my palace, feasting while you starved. I have traveled in the shadows. I have sat with the wisest minds within our borders and beyond. I have sought out those who have built kingdoms from the ashes of ruin, those who have turned hunger into abundance, those who have turned despair into hope. I have searched for solutions. Real solutions. And today, I have returned not just with words, but with a plan. A plan that will not be easy. A plan that will demand sacrifice. A plan that will test the strength of our people, just as fire tests gold. Because, my people, let me tell you this, hard problems require hard solutions. What we face is not an ordinary challenge, and so we cannot afford ordinary responses. We will not find our salvation in empty promises or quick fixes. We will not rebuild Abakar with whispers of hope alone. We must carve a new destiny with our own hands, with our own sweat, with our own determination. And so, My people, prepare yourselves, because change is coming. Not tomorrow. Not next year. Today. The king paused. A hush had fallen over the crowd. For the first time in years, the people of Abakar were not murmuring in anger. They were listening. And King Olumide was just getting started. The silence in the crowd was replaced by an eager, uneasy anticipation. The people of Abakar had never seen their king speak this way before. His words were not wrapped in diplomacy or the usual comforting platitudes. This was a king who had been shaken. A king who had come to fight. King Olumide took a deep breath, raised his gaze to meet the sea of expectant eyes before him, and continued. My people, Abakar is bleeding from many wounds. Wounds that have been left untreated for too long. Wounds that have festered, spreading sickness through our land. And if we do not act now, if we do not rise as one, this kingdom will crumble beneath the weight of its own suffering. Today, I will speak plainly. I will not shield the truth from you, no matter how bitter it may be. There are 7 great evils that must be confronted if Abakar is to rise again. And the first of them is our security. Last night, while most of you slept, the palace was attacked. Not a rumor. Not a whisper of uncertainty. A fact. Armed men broke through the very walls of the royal chambers, aiming their blades at the very heart of this kingdom. They came for my family. If the king himself is not safe in his palace, then who among you is safe? For too long, we have pretended that the dangers lurking in our streets and along our borders are distant threats. That the crimes of a few will not swallow the peace of the many. That if we look away, the darkness will not consume us. But no more. We will root out these enemies from the shadows. We will hunt down those who seek to spread terror in our land. And we will strike so hard that no enemy will dare threaten Abakar again. Look around you. Look at the markets where prices rise like the midday sun, scorching the backs of the poor while filling the pockets of the rich. Look at the granaries, once overflowing, now half empty because food that should feed the people is hoarded by a greedy few. Look at the traders who struggle to make a living, forced to buy at prices set by the kingdom's oligarchs, those who sit in comfort while you suffer. They manipulate the markets. They control the trade routes. They hoard goods, driving up prices so they can drain the last coin from your hands. Even the clothes on your backs, the tools you use, the very homes you live in, all are victims of their greed. And some of these men, these traitors to Abakar, stand here among us now. Some of them sit within the walls of my palace, pretending to be loyal servants of the throne, while in secret, they sabotage every effort to restore this kingdom's prosperity. But they will go no further. Not one step more. Because today, I swear before you all, before the spirits of our ancestors, that the chains of corruption will be broken. Those who have grown fat while the people starve will answer for their deeds. Those who have built their wealth on the suffering of the many will be brought to justice. Those who think they are untouchable will be touched. A sudden roar erupted from the crowd. It started as a murmur, then a ripple, then a deafening wave of approval. People raised their fists. They stomped their feet. They shouted the king's name. For the first time in a long time, the people of Abakar were not afraid. For the first time, they believed. The king raised his hand, and the crowd slowly fell silent, though the fire in their eyes had only grown stronger. He took a deep breath, his voice steady, his resolve unshaken. And this is just the beginning. Please subscribe. The king's voice, once heavy with the weight of crisis, now carried something else, a fire. He had seen the spark ignite in his people, felt their anger turn into belief. But anger alone would not rebuild Abakar. Knowledge would. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the sea of expectant faces. Then he spoke. My people, what is the greatest poverty? Some say it is the poverty of the stomach. The hunger that makes a man steal a loaf of bread just to keep his children alive. Some say it is the poverty of the pocket. The lack of wealth that forces a woman to labor from dawn till dusk, yet never earn enough to buy her own freedom. But I tell you today, the worst poverty is the poverty of the mind. When the mind is poor, the body suffers. When the mind is poor, a nation crumbles. When the mind is poor, a people remain in chains, even when their hands are free. Do you know why the rich and powerful fear education? Because an educated man is a good follower, but a terrible slave. You cannot chain a man who knows his worth. You cannot deceive a woman who understands her rights. You cannot rule a people who have opened their eyes to truth. But ignorance, mediocrity, idleness, these are the breeding grounds of crime. They say an idle mind is the devil's workshop. I say, An uneducated people are the devil's army. If we do not arm ourselves with knowledge, we will forever be at the mercy of those who seek to control us. So today, I make this decree. From this moment forward, education in Abakar shall be free and compulsory. Not just for our children, but for every man and woman who desires to learn. From the smallest child who takes their first step into a classroom, to the eldest among us who still dreams of learning to read and write, the kingdom will bear the cost. For those who seek technical training, we will train you. For those who desire adult education, we will teach you. For those who wish to rise beyond what fate has given them, we will provide the ladder. Because a nation that does not invest in knowledge is a nation doomed to slavery. And Abakar will never be a nation of slaves. The crowd erupted. Not in murmurs. Not in polite applause. Not in whispers of approval. A deafening, earth-shaking roar filled the air. Men wept openly. Women dropped to their knees, hands raised to the sky. The palace guards had to push back the surging mass of people as they rushed forward in gratitude, their cheers drowning out every other sound. The king stood still, letting the waves of emotion wash over him. He had expected applause. He had expected excitement. But this was hope. Raw. Unfiltered. Alive. It took the combined effort of the guards and protocol officers to restore order, as the people refused to quiet down, their voices still echoing through the air. Finally, after what seemed like eternity, the king raised his hand, and the noise slowly subsided. He took a deep breath. And we are not done yet. The energy in the air was still electrifying from the previous announcement. The people of Abakar were already overwhelmed with emotions, but the king was not done. He paused, looking at the sea of faces before him. Men and women who had tilled the land for generations, yet still struggled to feed their own families. This was for them. This was for the future. He took a deep breath and raised his voice once more. My people, let us speak of the land. The land that has fed us for generations. The land that carried our ancestors. The land that, today, cries out for revival. We have relied on the soil of Abakar for centuries, yet we have not treated it with the respect it deserves. We have abandoned our farms for quick riches. We have left our lands barren, hoping that food will fall from the sky. We have watched as greedy middlemen, who have never lifted a hoe or planted a single seed, grow wealthy off the sweat of our struggling farmers. This ends today. Agriculture is the backbone of any great nation. And from this day forward, Abakar will rise through the power of the land. We will begin where all things begin, with education. From grade 3 in every primary school, our children will be taught the art of growing vegetables and ornamental crops. By secondary school, they will learn to cultivate food crops and transform their school compounds into fruit orchards. Let every young soul understand that agriculture is not a punishment, not a burden, but a path to power and prosperity. And beyond the schools, we must bring agriculture into our homes. From this moment, it is mandatory that every household in Abakar must plant at least 2 forest trees in their compound. No new building shall be approved by the town planning authority without fulfilling this obligation. Because trees do not just give us fruit, they give us life. For those who seek to farm on a larger scale, we will clear the path for them. Every local government will have dedicated farmland settlements where people can go into full-time farming. The obstacles that have frustrated our farmers for years will be torn down. Farming inputs, seeds, fertilizers, irrigation systems, pesticides will be heavily subsidized. Agricultural loans and grants will not just exist on paper, they will be readily available and accessible. For too long, our farmers have been trapped in outdated methods. This is no longer acceptable. We will import modern farming machinery. We will encourage the local production of agricultural tools. We will ensure that Abakar is not left behind in agricultural advancements. For too long, our farmers have been at the mercy of greedy merchants who buy at low prices, hoard goods, and sell at outrageous rates when scarcity hits. This stops now. We will establish a price control ministry that will regulate the prices of both agricultural products and household commodities. No longer will farmers harvest in abundance only to sell at a loss. No longer will food rot away while people go hungry. To stabilize prices, the kingdom will construct storage facilities in every part of the land. The government will purchase excess produce from farmers and ensure stable profits, so that no farmer is forced to sell his crops for next to nothing, only to watch the same crops be sold at 10 times the price a few months later. Abakar will not suffer hunger while its soil remains fertile. Abakar will not let its farmers toil in vain. Abakar will rise again. The crowd erupted once more. The cheers were deafening. The ground itself seemed to shake with the force of their voices. Farmers wept openly. Elders embraced one another, overwhelmed with hope. Women raised their voices in ululation, their cries piercing the sky like victory trumpets. It was not just joy they felt, it was the feeling of a people breaking free. The palace guards and protocol officers struggled to maintain order, but nothing could contain the wave of emotion. The king stood, absorbing it all. He had given them hope. But he was not finished. He raised a single hand. Slowly, the noise began to settle. And when silence returned, the king spoke again. But we are not done yet. The thunderous applause from the agricultural reforms had barely settled when the king raised his hand again. He could see it in their faces, hope rekindled, faith restored. But he was not done. There was still more to say, more to change. He took a deep breath and continued, his voice unwavering, his heart heavy with purpose. My people, no kingdom can stand against the tides of time if it does not evolve. For too long, Abakar has lagged behind in innovation, watching as other nations forge ahead while we remain bound to outdated methods. But no more. From this day forward, we will embrace a technological renaissance. We will establish centers of innovation where our brightest minds will be trained in modern science, engineering, and digital technology. Every school in Abakar, from the smallest village to the grandest city, will have access to modern learning materials and digital education. We will send our young scholars abroad to learn and return with knowledge that will propel Abakar into the future. And we will not only consume technology, we will create it. We will build our own industries, our own research centers, our own manufacturing plants. Please subscribe. Abakar will no longer be a kingdom that imports ideas, we will become a kingdom that exports them. The people roared again, but the king pressed forward, his vision expanding beyond their immediate borders. For too long, we have allowed foreign nations to dictate the terms of our survival. We have bent our backs, taken scraps from the tables of others, and watched as our resources were exploited by outsiders while our people suffered. That era is over. Abakar will stand on equal footing with other nations. We will engage in diplomacy, not as beggars, but as partners. We will trade, not as desperate buyers, but as producers with power. We will welcome investors, but on our own terms. No longer will foreign interests take from us without giving back. From this day forth, Abakar will command the respect it deserves on the world stage. The ground shook again as the people cheered. Our land is rich, yet our people are poor. Why? Because for generations, a select few have controlled the wealth of this kingdom, hoarding riches that should have been shared by all. This will not continue. From now on, we will indigenize our economy. Our industries will be owned by our own people. Our markets will thrive on the backs of Abakarians, not foreign corporations who seek only to drain us. We will commercialize our resources wisely, ensuring that the wealth of our land flows to the people who own it. No longer will a small group of oligarchs control the price of goods. No longer will the poor starve while the rich build golden palaces. We will reclaim our economy and place it in the hands of those who work for it, not those who exploit it. The crowd erupted in wild applause, some raising their fists, others falling to their knees in gratitude. Our kingdom is rich, richer than many know. We have gold beneath our feet. We have oil in our lands. We have minerals in our rivers. Yet, we struggle to survive. Why? Because for too long, our natural wealth has been drained away by corruption, poor leadership, and the greed of foreign and local exploiters. No more. From this day forward, Abakar will control its resources with wisdom and justice. We will balance our imports and exports, ensuring that we produce what we consume and consume what we produce. We will establish trade policies that favor our people, not just the elite. And most importantly, we will ensure that every single citizen benefits from the riches of this land. The people clapped until their hands ached. Some screamed in joy, others wept openly. But, my people, wealth alone is not enough. Progress alone is not enough. We must protect what makes us who we are. We are Abakarians. We have a culture, a history, a legacy that must not be erased by foreign influence or modern corruption. From today, we will uphold our traditions, but only those that elevate us. Any cultural practice that enslaves us, that binds us to the past in chains, will be abolished. No more child labor. No more early and forced marriages. No more human sacrifice. No more practices that rob us of our dignity as a modern people. Abakar will be a land of progress, justice, and equality. The people screamed, wailed, and prayed aloud. Some collapsed to the ground as if in a trance. Guards struggled to contain the crowd. The atmosphere was electric, divine, overwhelming. The king raised his hand for silence. When the crowd finally quieted, he spoke his last words with solemn power. "And finally, my people, I decree this. From this moment, the judiciary of Abakar shall be free. The press shall be free. The government shall serve the people, not rule over them. And this charity will begin in my own palace." At that moment, the entire kingdom exploded into uncontainable, earth-shaking jubilation. Some cried until their voices failed. Some prayed at the top of their lungs. Some stood frozen in disbelief, unable to process the reality of what they had just heard. For the first time in a generation, Abakar had hope. The king had spoken. The dawn had come. The king stood, his heart pounding in his chest. This moment, this revolution, this rebirth of Abakar, would begin not only with words but with action. And charity, as he had declared, would begin in his own palace. He looked at his people, now united, now burning with hope and purpose. "My people," he began, his voice deep with finality, "everything I have spoken today will not remain as mere words. It will be lived out, enacted, and enforced. And to prove to you that this is no mere speech but the dawn of a new era, I shall begin by breaking a tradition within my own household. For years, our laws have dictated that the royal bloodline must only mix with nobility, that status is determined by birth, not by deeds. But today, I tell you, true nobility is not of blood but of character, of sacrifice, of honor." A hush fell over the crowd. A sacred silence. The king's eyes scanned the sea of faces before settling on one man, a man who stood tall yet visibly shaken. He turned back to his people. "Do you know," the king asked slowly, "this man, this warrior, this legend who has fought against poverty, against slavery, against imprisonment, and against fate itself? A man who, with nothing but the strength in his hands and the fire in his heart, defied every obstacle set before him? A man who risked his very life to save my daughter? A man who, with what little fate placed in his hands, rebuilt himself, not for greed, not for ambition, but for duty and love?" The silence broke. Like a storm rising over the hills, the people began to murmur, then to chant. At first, a few voices. Then dozens. Then hundreds. Then the entire kingdom roared in unison, shaking the very earth beneath their feet. "Kelechi! Kelechi! Kelechi!" The name rolled like thunder across the land. And Kelechi, the once-forgotten palace guard, stood frozen as the weight of destiny crashed upon his shoulders. As the cheers shook the heavens, a figure rose. The princess. The very jewel of the kingdom, the symbol of grace, beauty, and royal elegance, stood from her seat. Not hurriedly, not hesitantly, but with royal purpose. With every step, her delicate gown shimmered in the afternoon sun, and a hush fell once again over the people as they watched a fairy tale unfold before their eyes. She descended the grand steps, her mother and her maid Nina following closely behind. And when she reached Kelechi, who stood visibly shaken, the entire kingdom held its breath. With a gaze full of warmth, gratitude, and something even deeper, something eternal, she lifted her delicate hands and gently placed them on Kelechi's shoulders. "Please subscribe." And then, in the presence of all of Abakar, she leaned in and kissed him deeply. Gasps rippled through the crowd. For the first time, there was no hierarchy, no royal protocol, no barriers of status, only love. As she pulled away, she whispered, her voice trembling but firm, "Kelechi, you saved my life. And I promised, I will save yours too." Tears welled in Kelechi's eyes, but before he could speak, a new wave of movement surged forward. Kelechi's parents, his aged father and tearful mother, stepped forward, their hands trembling as they touched their son, overwhelmed by the moment. The royal advisors, once skeptical of change, now bowed before him in acceptance. Then came waves of well-wishers, guards, councilmen, ministers, nobles, and commoners alike, all pressing forward to congratulate Kelechi and his princess. The kingdom had never witnessed such a moment before. It was no longer just a political rally. It was the dawn of a new history. The air became thick with emotion. Some wept openly. Some lifted their hands in prayer. Some stood frozen, as if in a trance, unable to process the miracle they had just witnessed. And when the king finally raised his hand to dismiss the gathering, the people did not leave in a hurry. No. They stood for long moments, reluctant to part with the day that had changed their world. When the last of them finally departed, the palace guards, the guests, the ministers, the nobles, all were physically drained, emotionally exhausted, overwhelmed beyond words. For never in the history of Abakar had there been a day like this. And perhaps, never would there be again. But one thing was certain. A new era had begun. Please subscribe. At the palace the following day, as the golden sun bathed the royal courtyard in its morning glow, a messenger arrived from the king's advisers. He knelt respectfully before the guards and announced his purpose. The royal advisers seek the king's audience, he declared. They ask if His Majesty is ready for the family meeting. The room fell into a hush. All eyes turned to the king, who sat in deep thought, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the armrest of his grand chair. He had expected this. The meeting was inevitable. But before he could respond, the queen, with the quiet authority that had become her signature, lifted her head and spoke first. "Tell them to come," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "We are more than ready." A flicker of amusement danced in the king's eyes. Without a word, he simply nodded his approval. The messenger bowed and departed swiftly to deliver the response. Within moments, the palace was alive with anticipation. The advisers arrived at the palace at the scheduled time, their expressions calm and unreadable. Without wasting a moment on pleasantries, their leader stepped forward and bowed slightly before the king. "Your Majesty," he said smoothly, "we request a private chamber for this meeting." The king studied their faces, his sharp gaze probing for any hint of their intentions. Finally, with a small nod, he gestured to the guards. "Lead them to the inner chamber," he commanded. The guards bowed and swiftly escorted the advisers into one of the most secure halls of the palace, a room reserved for only the most sensitive discussions. The chamber was adorned with gold-inlaid carvings of the kingdom's history, and the torches burned steadily, casting flickering shadows along the polished walls. When all was settled, the king, flanked by his queen and the princess, took his seat. Silence hung in the air like an unsheathed blade. Then, the female adviser, with an unwavering gaze, made a bold request. "Your Majesty, before we begin, we ask your indulgence to invite two individuals to join us, Kelechi, the young man to whom your daughter is promised, and Nina, the princess's maid." The words barely left her lips when the queen's composure snapped. "You people are treading beyond your boundaries," she retorted, her voice sharp. "Yes, Kelechi has been promised the princess, but he is not yet part of the royal family. Until the necessary rites and ceremonies have been performed, he remains an outsider." Her gaze flicked to the female adviser, her displeasure unmistakable. "And as for Nina," she continued, her tone laced with finality, "she is just an ordinary maid, nothing more. Why must she be included in private palace matters?" A heavy silence followed her words. The queen's expression was fierce, her authority absolute. Then, as if to cement her stance, she stamped her foot against the marble floor. "Never!" The moment the word left her lips, the most senior of the advisers calmly straightened his posture and spoke. "Then we leave." His words were like a thunderclap in the chamber. The queen's expression faltered slightly, but the adviser continued, his voice steady as ever. "And please, your Majesty, arrange for our safe exit from this kingdom, for there are many who seek our hurt." A chill settled over the room. "For your information, your Highness," he added, turning directly to the queen, "prepare your palace for a long, drawn-out war with its enemies. And chief among them is Chief Agbonna and his loyal dynasty." The mention of war was like a dagger to the queen's chest. Her face lost all color. Then, as if an invisible wave had swept over her, her body trembled, and beads of sweat began to form on her forehead. The king, watching his wife's reaction and contrasting it with his daughter's unruffled composure, clenched his fists. His teeth ground together as he weighed his options. Finally, his voice came, quiet but edged with steel. "Guards," he called. Two palace guards immediately stepped forward. "Go. Bring Kelechi and Nina." Within moments, the heavy doors of the chamber swung open, and Kelechi and Nina were ushered in by the palace guards. The young man and the maid stepped forward cautiously, their expressions unreadable. Kelechi's posture was straight, his face marked with quiet determination, while Nina's head was slightly bowed in deference, though her eyes held something deep and unfathomable. The king's gaze settled on them, moving from Kelechi to Nina, as if trying to peer into their very souls, searching for their intentions, friend or foe, loyalty or betrayal. The chamber was silent, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on everyone present. Then, one of the advisers cleared his throat. "Nina," he said, his voice level yet firm. "Speak." At that command, Nina immediately knelt before the king, her forehead almost touching the floor. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice steady but hauntingly solemn. I am just a maid, but my ears have heard what they should not hear, and my eyes have seen what they should not see." The room tensed. "I have lived in the shadows of this palace, Your Majesty," she continued. "I have walked the hidden corridors, the places no royal dares to step. I have heard the whispers in the dark, the murmurs of those who claim loyalty by day but conspire by night. And I have learned the secrets of the throne, secrets even you, my king, do not know." The king's breath caught. Nina slowly lifted her face, her eyes gleaming with an eerie depth of knowledge. "Your Majesty, do you know that this palace, the very heart of our kingdom, has never been yours alone?" The king's fingers clenched against the armrest of his throne. "There are traditions, ancient and unbroken, that have ruled from the shadows. Customs that bind the throne in unseen chains. And there are forces, hidden yet powerful, that have dictated the fate of every king before you, and are now dictating yours." A shiver ran through the king's spine. For the first time in his reign, he felt fear, not just for his life, but for his throne, for everything he thought he controlled. His eyes locked onto Nina, and in that moment, she no longer looked like an ordinary maid. She looked like a goddess. The room fell into an eerie silence. All eyes were on Nina, the mere maid, yet at this moment she held the weight of history on her lips. She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering as she lifted her head to look directly at the king. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice steady, yet carrying an ancient sorrow that seemed to echo through the very walls of the palace. "Do you know how this kingdom came to be?" The king stiffened. The advisors shifted uneasily. Even the queen, who had earlier dismissed Nina, now leaned forward, as if drawn into the unseen force behind her words. "Abakar was not always a kingdom," she continued. "It was once a land of chaos. A land of warring villages, of rivers that ran red with the blood of fathers and sons. Of brothers slaughtering brothers. For decades, this land was nothing but a battlefield, a graveyard of unfulfilled destinies. Until one man changed everything." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "Bakar." The name floated in the air, as if calling forth a ghost from the depths of time. The king's eyes flickered, something about the name struck him deeply. Nina's voice grew stronger, filled with the authority of generations past. Bakar was not a king. He was not born into royalty, nor did he thirst for a throne. He was a simple man, a man with nothing but a dream, that the rivers of this land would flow with water, not blood. That children would grow up to bury their parents, not the other way around. That the land we stand on today would one day be called home by all, not just the victors of war. The chamber was deathly silent. It was my ancestors who stood beside him, through battles and betrayals. It was my ancestors who walked through fire, carrying messages between warring factions, forging secret pacts where swords had failed. And when Bakar fell, when his enemies struck him down before he could see his dream fulfilled, it was my ancestors who ensured his name would never be forgotten. She took a slow step forward, her voice now trembling with emotion. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "did your father never tell you? Did he never tell you that Bakar was the true founder of the land you now rule?" The king's fingers tightened around the armrest of his throne. His lips parted slightly, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of an entire kingdom's history, he said, "He did." A gasp rippled through the chamber. Nina nodded solemnly. "Then you must also know, Your Majesty, that while kings have come and gone, while thrones have risen and fallen, my family has remained. Not as rulers, not as conquerors, but as the silent keepers of the throne's greatest secrets. We have never worn the crown, but we have held its foundation in place. We have fought and died, not for power, but for the dream of Bakar, for the survival of Abakar itself." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "And now, Your Majesty, the very dream we bled for, is under threat once more." The king felt the weight of those words press against his chest, threatening to crush him. For the first time, he saw Nina not as a maid, not even as a woman, but as the living embodiment of an unbroken legacy, a bridge between the past and the present. And he knew, in that moment, that nothing in his kingdom would ever be the same again. The weight of truth fell upon the room like a sudden storm. Nina, still on her knees, lifted her chin, her eyes fierce with a fire that had been buried for generations. "Your Majesty," she continued, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart, "I am sorry to inform you that you, King Olymaid, have done what your fathers did with and for Bakar, honoring him with your mouth, yet living on his blood and that of his children. Your throne stands on the graves of those who made it possible, yet their descendants have been cast aside, forgotten, or worse, destroyed." The king's hands trembled on the armrest of his throne. The queen shifted uncomfortably, her fingers digging into the silk of her robe. The advisors exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to interrupt. There was never a single son or daughter of Bekar, Nina pressed on, that your fathers did not either imprison, impoverish, or unjustly kill. The only honor they have left is that this kingdom bears their ancestors' name. But even that, she exhaled sharply, as if the weight of centuries of injustice burned within her chest, even that has become a silent curse, a reminder that they can never claim the glory they rightfully deserve. A heavy silence swallowed the room. They have stopped celebrating, stopped claiming their place in history, not because they have forgotten, but because they fear for their lives. Their hearts still bleed for this kingdom, they still pray for its prosperity, but like your fathers before you, the throne has clung to honoring the children and grandchildren of the kingdom's greatest traitors. The wealth of Abakar has been wickedly, cruelly, and unjustly bequeathed to one family. She stopped abruptly, as if the words burned too hot on her tongue. The king, whose face had been a canvas of unreadable expressions, suddenly sat forward. His voice, strained and filled with revelation, cut through the silence. Adanna. Nina bowed her head. Yes, my lord. The name sent ripples of discomfort through the chamber. The queen gasped, her hands flying to her chest. One of the older advisors sucked in a sharp breath, while another clenched his jaw so tightly that his cheek twitched. But Nina was not done. She looked up, her voice a whisper now, yet far more powerful than a scream. Tell me, your majesty, does the palace even remember the Bekar family? Does the throne care whether they still exist or if they have gone extinct? The king opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in his reign, he felt small. Not as a king. Not as a ruler of men. But as a mere piece in a grand, cruel game played long before his time. His ancestors had rewritten history, twisted the truth into convenient lies, silenced the voices of those who had bled for this land, and he had unknowingly upheld it all. He turned slowly to his advisors, his gaze sharp, accusing. Is this true? He demanded. No one spoke. The air in the chamber became thick with unsaid words, with guilt, with shame. The most senior advisor, an old man with a face carved by time and regret, let out a weary sigh. He bowed his head. It is, your majesty. The king inhaled sharply, his hands curling into fists. Then tell me, now, he ordered, his voice barely contained fury. Where is the Bekar family? Do they still live? The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, the senior advisor spoke, his voice laced with the sorrow of many years. The last known descendants of Bekar were scattered to the farthest reaches of the kingdom, stripped of their land, their wealth, their voices. Some were forced into slavery, others disappeared without a trace. Many were executed. The throne made sure of it. Please subscribe. The king felt his stomach twist. And yet Adanna's dynasty, he spat the name like poison, has flourished. The old advisor nodded grimly. Yes, my lord. Because they were the ones who betrayed Bekar. And the throne has always favored the betrayers over the betrayed. A bitter laugh erupted from Nina's lips. And you wonder why this kingdom is cursed, she said, shaking her head. The words sliced through the room like a blade. The queen turned to the king, her face pale with horror. Olyamide, she whispered, as if suddenly realizing the magnitude of their past sins. The king clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. Enough. His voice was low, but the weight of his fury filled the chamber. Find them, he ordered, his eyes burning with something far greater than anger, a thirst for justice. Find the remaining Bekar bloodline. Bring them to me. Let it be known that from this day forward, this injustice will not stand. He turned to Nina. And you, he said, his voice softer now, who are you truly, to know all this? Nina took a deep breath and rose to her feet. For the first time, she stood tall, not as a maid, not as a servant of the palace, but as a daughter of history. I am the last of them, your majesty, she declared. I am Bekar's blood. The room erupted in chaos. The silence in the chamber was suffocating, but Nina's voice carried the weight of generations, slicing through the stillness like a blade. She turned her gaze toward Kelechi, her brother, the last of Bekar's sons, a man who had lived his life in ignorance of the legacy that flowed through his veins. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the sheer burden of truth. And here he stands, my brother, my blood. One of the only surviving sons of Bekar. The king flinched, as if struck by a blow. The queen's breath hitched in her throat. The advisors exchanged panicked glances, their faces drained of color. He must not know, Nina continued, her eyes burning with unshed tears. His father must not tell him. No, he must never know his origin. It was decreed, wasn't it? That the sons of Bakhar must live as ghosts in their own land, stripped of their past, their birthright buried beneath the lies of the throne. She turned sharply, her gaze locking onto the king's, unflinching, demanding his soul to bear witness. Yet, your majesty, the blood of his ancestors runs in him. The blood of loyalty. The blood of sacrifice and selflessness. And yes, the blood of martyrdom. Kelechi stiffened beside her, confusion knitting his brow. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. His entire world was unraveling before him. Nina's voice grew sharper, each word a dagger. For you must kill him, mustn't you? She spat bitterly. That the princess might marry Ojin, the son of your enemy, so that the legacy of betrayal can continue. The weight of her words crushed the room. The queen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The advisors shifted uneasily, their silence a confirmation of the wicked truth. The king trembled. The floor beneath Kelechi seemed to vanish. Look at him, Nina pressed, stepping toward the throne, her voice raw with emotion. Look at Kelechi, the man you would have slaughtered in ignorance. He lost his life to save your daughter, my princess. The king's lips quivered. And with what was he rewarded? She demanded, her voice rising, filled with righteous fury. Imprisonment. Torture. The agony of chains meant for criminals. And if fate had not intervened, if the gods had not conspired against your cruelty, if his mother had not been driven to madness and her breasts had not cried out to the gods of the land for mercy, you would have killed him by now. A sharp sob escaped from the queen. The king, the great ruler of Abakar, the mighty descendant of kings, the man who had never shed a tear in public, lowered his head. His shoulders shook. His hands trembled. And before the eyes of his court, before his advisors, his queen, his daughter, and the forsaken children of Bakhar, King Olimide wept. The weight of the truth pressed against the walls of the chamber, thick and suffocating. Nina's voice, once trembling with emotion, now carried the sharpness of a blade cutting through years of deceit. She turned to the king, her eyes fierce with certainty. See, my lord. She gestured toward the grand throne, as if the very seat of power trembled under the weight of unspoken truths. You know the people behind the social, economic, and cultural woes plaguing this land. Yes, your majesty, you know. The room fell into a deep hush. Even the flickering torches seemed to pause, as if afraid to bear witness to what was coming next. Agbonna and his wretched son, Ojin. Her voice dripped with disdain. A man who is not worthy to wipe the dust from the feet of my delicate and wise-hearted princess. The queen flinched, her fingers tightening on the hem of her robe. Ojin, Nina continued, her voice now laced with something dangerously close to pity, who is not even the true son of Agbonna. The air grew thick with disbelief. The king's brow furrowed. What? Yes, my king. Nina's words struck like thunder. Ojin was brought into Agbonna's household through the conspiracy of his wife, so that the status quo might remain. A murmur rippled through the advisors. Even the guards standing at attention stiffened. Your Majesty, Nina pressed on, Ojin is the son of a slave girl. And Agbonna is not his father. The king jolted forward. Lies. His voice cracked with a mixture of fury and fear. No, my lord. Nina shook her head, unwavering. Not lies. And the greatest betrayal. He himself knows it. The queen's breath hitched. The king's fingers gripped the armrest of his throne, his knuckles turning white. Nina turned sharply, her eyes landing on the princess. The weight of 1,000 secrets pressed down on the air between them. And your daughter, my princess, she knows. A stunned silence gripped the chamber. The queen gasped. The king's head snapped toward Adanna. My princess, Nina said, her voice soft now, almost pleading, don't you know? The princess, her face composed yet unreadable, lifted her gaze to meet Nina's. And then, in a voice so soft it could have been mistaken for a whisper, she said, I know. Please subscribe. The king's body went rigid. He turned to his daughter, disbelief widening his eyes. Adanna, he swallowed, his throat dry. You knew all this. The princess, regal and composed, nodded. Yes, my king. The room was silent. And then, like the slow, inevitable cracking of a dam, the truth flooded the chamber, drowning the kingdom's deepest deception in its wake. The chamber was now deathly silent. Even the flickering flames of the torches seemed to hesitate, as if afraid to disturb the moment. Nina exhaled slowly, her eyes scanning the faces of those before her. Then, with a voice steady as steel, she spoke again. "My king, it is only you and my queen who were in the dark about all this." The queen stiffened beside the king, her face paling. "All the palace maids are aware." Gasps rippled through the room. The advisors exchanged uneasy glances. Nina turned sharply, her gaze locking onto the guards standing rigidly behind the king. Even the guards knew. A heavy pause. Then, with deliberate emphasis, she added, "including Tattoo." The guard, who had stood motionless like a statue, trembled visibly. The king turned around to look at him, his expression dark with disbelief. Tattoo's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no words came out. And then, suddenly, the king laughed. A strange, hollow laughter. A laughter filled with hysteria and pain. It echoed through the chamber, bouncing off the high walls, unsettling even the bravest hearts in the room. With a weary wave of his hand, he motioned for Nina to continue. She swallowed and pressed on. "My king, by now, you, your wife, and every single one of us here, including these innocent advisors, would have been dead, passed on to the great beyond, courtesy of Chief Adanna and his sinister bastard of a son." The queen gasped audibly. The king's fingers clenched into fists. "If not for my spirited efforts," Nina continued, her voice ringing with quiet defiance, "there would have been no throne to return to, no kingdom left to rule." A deadly silence followed. She inhaled sharply, then let out the words that would forever change the course of history. "When I caught wind of Chief Adanna's plot against the throne, and against your guests, the Bekar spirit in me was aroused." She turned slightly, her eyes meeting the princess's. "With the permission of my princess, I went to Ojin's court, carrying bottles of the hardest wine. I presented them to him as gifts from you, my king, to appease his wrath and convince him that Adanna was his." The queen gasped, her trembling hands reaching for her daughter, but the princess stood firm. Nina continued, her voice unwavering. Intoxicated by his foolishness and pride, he opened the bottles. He gulped 3 without hesitation. A ripple of murmurs surged through the room. Drunk beyond reason, he boasted of his triumph, of how his hired killers were waiting in the shadows, ready to strike. He confessed every detail of the planned massacre, believing himself untouchable. The king shut his eyes, his breath coming in slow, deliberate exhales. "The moment I left, I ran straight to my brother's house, Kelechi's house." She gestured toward Kelechi, whose face remained impassive but whose fists were tightly clenched. "Together, we plotted a counter-offensive." The advisors exchanged glances, realization dawning on them. "We mobilized a few trusted palace guards, and before the assassins could arrive, we evacuated the advisors to Kelechi's farmhouse." A heavy pause. "From there, we returned to the palace yesterday morning, just before your public address." The king leaned back, rubbing his temple, exhausted beyond words. Nina let the weight of her words settle before speaking again. "My lord, that is my truth in a nutshell." She then knelt once more, bowing her head. "Do with me whatever seems right to you." A long silence followed. Then, in a voice drained of energy, the king responded. "Permission granted." "Nina." She rose slowly, her heart steady, her fate resting in the hands of a king whose world had just crumbled before him.